I am Pastor Sherman Bradley, co-pastor of the Warehouse Church, along with my wife, Sidell Bradley. And tonight we are, if you're home, glad you're joining us because it took me 95 minutes to get from downtown Cincinnati out north to my home. So if you're in the Cincinnati area and you're still out and about, we are praying for your safety. It is a bit of a mess, and the temperatures are dropping, and it is only going to freeze. So tonight, we will continue in our series, A Thin Line Between Love and Hate. But before we do, in honor of Black History Month, and as I wait for some I know who are going to jump on here in the next few minutes, I want to throw a trivia question out there. Does anybody out there know who the real life character of the Lone Ranger actually is modeled after? Does anybody know who the Lone Ranger is modeled after? A actual person. Now, I found this out from my father. I didn't even know this tidbit of Black history myself. And the answer is Bass Reeves. Yes, Bass Reeves. He was born in Paris, Texas in 1838. And he is the first black U.S. Marshal, U.S. Deputy Marshal. And out west, it was rough terrain. To be a marshal in that time frame was no small feat. To get the respect, he was about 6'2". He was a charismatic individual. They said he was quite humorous, and he was a well-built, strong individual. And Bass was basically a bounty hunter. And he would go out looking for criminals and bring them into justice. He was a sharpshooter. And Bass is believed to be the character that then spawned the Lone Ranger. Now, I don't know where Tonto comes in, but as far as it relates to the Lone Ranger, Bass Reeves, the first U.S. Deputy Marshal, first African American U.S. Deputy Marshal. So there's a bit of information you may not have known, as I didn't. And so we are grateful as we continue to commemorate things that are historical and pertinent to American culture, even though we consider it Black History Month. It is actually American history. So tonight, a thin line between love and hate. Last week, Pastor Sidell masterfully shared for us about the love that is to happen in Christendom amongst the ethnics that are represented in the U.S. And there are 3 points I want to highlight. I want to review quickly before we transition into this week's study. And the first one is, you must not harbor hatred against your brother in your heart. And one of the scriptures she used was Leviticus 19:17 through 18. Directly rebuke your neighbor so that you will not incur guilt on account of him. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against any of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. And we know Jesus said, who is my neighbor? But they that do the will of my Father. And then those that are in the family of the human race. We are to love. And this interesting thing about love, the other point she made was, love actually has an opposite, that is to love someone less. Not hate, which seems to be at the other end of the spectrum if we're to put up bookends, but love, and the opposite is to love someone less. Not at the extreme all the way out there to hate, but love and love someone less is the opposite. Imagine that, to think about that, to esteem them less or to leave someone unloved. And then the second point was the New Testament church, or the third point rather, was the New Testament church was founded in the climate of supremacist culture. For the Jewish community back then hated Gentiles and Samaritans. It was so prevalent that even Peter and Paul had to have divine interventions from Jesus himself in order to open themselves to what God was calling them to versus what they had traditionally and some might say religiously had been engaging in their practices as people of faith. And so when you look at a thin line between love and hate, love someone less. You don't have to wait to get to down the road to hate before you have found yourself at odds with Jesus. Because Jesus wants us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And in that love, we must love self to have that to give away to someone other than ourselves. And that brings us to tonight, where we want to talk about the poor always with us. This thin line between love and hate, how does it play itself out amongst the poor in our society and around the world? We know that there are great disparities in socioeconomics in our country. We know you can have two entirely different life experiences. And you don't have to go as far as those who are void and homeless, void of having anything for themselves and homeless, to the 1%. You don't have to go to those extremes to have to look within the depths of what's happening in America. Because there are far more people in poverty who do have housing opportunities than those that are homeless, that are struggling, and it does not have to be so. And part of their struggle is that we have loved them less. So let's look at John chapter 12. We're reading from the New Living Translation. We're going to read from verses 1 through 8. 6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with them. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The whole house was filled with the fragrance. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, "That perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor." Not that he cared for the poor, he was a thief. And since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not have me always. You will not always have me." So here's a question tonight. How do we love the poor less? How do we love the poor less? And what is your earliest recollection of being associated with the poor? Was it a term used to describe your family? Or perhaps a neighbor's family? Or perhaps a relative? Or was it connected to a stranger? Was your first experience in service to someone who was considered by society to be poor? What is your earliest recollection of being associated with the poor. I want you to think back. And I want to know, how do you think that framed your interactions as you would continue to grow, to mature, to relate, or to find yourself at a distance? In this story in John 12, it's in the other Gospels as well. This one is most closely related to Judas' statement and his intent. It's in verse 6, where he acknowledges in words what, if taken at face value, would seem to show he has consideration for the poor. He did state a fact: the perfume that could have or may have cost almost a year's wages could have gone to help feed people who were poor. That is a fact. But the truth of the matter is, because not every fact is going to lead you to the truth. The truth of the matter is, he's a thief, he was responsible for the funds, and he was dipping in it, taking for himself, with little care, if any at all, for those who were impoverished. I think it's evident in just how he is so brazen in the midst of this scene that's taking place, being depicted by John. Lazarus has just been raised from the dead. They're celebrating Lazarus' existence, literal existence. He was not only dead, he was stankin' dead. They said that it had been several days. His body had already begun to deteriorate. There was nothing tangibly left there that would give an inference of they just did mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and the body now has life in it again because the heart was still pumping. No, none of that was accessible. This was a miracle. I know there's no such thing as miracles, but the thing just comes to mind to me. I mean, this is a miracle, a profound, miraculous event that has taken place. They're at the home with Mary and Martha, the family, Jesus' friends. These are as close to him as family is close to him. And all that Judas can think about is the money could have been spent on the poor, as if he's noble, as if he's righteous, as if he has any moral fiber in him, really, toward the poor. And he does not. And it will become evident. I would suspect that John may not have known that in the moment, but as he's writing about it, we're clear because of the events that took place later. I spent 10 years at a homeless shelter, 5 years running the actual shelter, 10 years running a drug rehab program for men. And we had several thousand volunteers. We were open 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, and with over 2,000 volunteers coming in and out of the facility, we were responsible for making sure that our volunteer base understood those that we came to serve, those that we had set up programming and processes to help them not just get out from under the elements and have shelter and food and clothing. That's basic. That should be without thought. There should be processes making housing accessible for those that are in greatest need without all of the agony and disappointment and frustration that comes with having to constantly sell our society that this is a righteous thing to do, a very good thing to do, a thing that is loving and compassionate and caring. But there were volunteers who would come in, and one of the tall tale signs of the struggle of getting people to actually love on the people that were there and understand the magnitude of some of the trauma and experiences that they have gone through that have led them to this particular point in time where they're in need, some temporarily, of housing, to get themselves back to a place of being able to sustain housing and a lifestyle on their own was Thanksgiving. For some reason, well, not for some reason, I'm trying to be polite here, but on Thanksgiving, we would be inundated with volunteers who were coming on this day of Thanksgiving, and we would stop taking volunteers several weeks prior to Thanksgiving Day because we would have too many. And they would bring oftentimes their family and their children. And this was a day that they would come down and they would feel good about themselves and taking this opportunity to share a service, an act of service, because there are poor people, homeless people, hungry people, and they would come down to serve a meal. And we would share with them the needs that we have the other 364 days a year. But most of them we would never see again. And unfortunately, the truth be told, that was not about the people in need. Most of the time, that was about the person who came to give a day, a moment, a few hours, and could go back and say they served. But what ultimately is needed, what is most significant about helping someone in poverty is relationship, significant relationship. Relationship of mutual respect that offers them empathy and warmth and an opportunity to be heard as much as it is to receive whatever those elements of felt needs are required to help them to transition. That requires a lot more of us. One of the challenges that we faced in this process was also helping them to understand that there are different value structures inside different classes. And the middle class and upper middle class and wealthy have different value structures versus those coming from generational poverty. And generational poverty being described as 2 or more generations of a person and their lineage who lived in poverty, in a socioeconomic state. And the numbers have varied as to how much you earn a year or less that qualifies you for the poverty index in America. But whatever that index is, if you fall below that line, then you've been considered in poverty socioeconomically. And if you've been living that for generations, there are certain values that come with that. And one of the difficulties with getting folk who have not been in poverty recently or never lived in poverty before was to understand that the values are not necessarily bad, they're just different. And in order to do so, one has to step out of themselves and into the seat and the feet of someone who's living that lifestyle to fully comprehend, to really be empathetic, to really walk with rather than provide perhaps a hand out versus a hand up. And handouts, there are reasons for needing things and there's a need for funding. But when it comes to individuals who want to volunteer, then there's much more required than oftentimes individuals have thought about or have been willing or capable of setting aside the time to really engage in a way that is lasting, that's building an interaction that transfers information so that others can experience what it is that you want them to see and not just hear you speaking at them. And that was one of the rubs that was always challenging for us in our leading our volunteer base, helping them to be with rather than wanting to always see an immediate transformation because they gave something or they did something, when this is a journey, this is a long haul, this is a marathon for many individuals who are working through some very difficult past experiences. And so the question becomes, what's your last experience? Are you engaging in ways that allow you to use your gifts and abilities to assist those who are struggling? In the U.S. and even in the U.S. church, there's a thin line between this love and this hate. The idea that Judas was pretending to care for the poor and really didn't is something that I've seen far too much of in our society. Sometimes it's with good intentions, but good intentions don't really afford much to people who are in greatest need. I would provide trainings, and there were times where I would ask people to stop handing out money as you pull off an exit and you're sitting there in your car waiting and somebody's standing there with a sign. I said, I prefer you give them food or you give them direction to places that they can go to get services and needs met. Because that $5, that $1, even that $20 bill is not what's of greatest need to them. Money is not their greatest need. Their greatest need is someone looking beyond those immediate interactions of 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and really giving them an opportunity to share their story, to really be with them and not just hand them a handout. One of the greatest examples of this that we had in those times was when we transitioned from analog to digital technology. And all of these smart TVs were coming out, and you had to get a box in order to use your analog television if you were going to keep it. So people naturally did not want to keep those, and they were going out and buying the new televisions, but they were dropping the old analog televisions off at a homeless shelter. Homeless shelter. We're inundated with homeless people, and they want to drop off televisions. And they did not even purchase the $35 converter box so that if someone did want the television, they could take it home, if they actually had a home, and plug it in, and it would actually work. How is that helping the poor? How is that really considering the situation that someone is in? We were not that kind of facility. We did not have storage for all these. We were turning them away, and people were angry with me. There were some who were driving up in pickup trucks and vans with the big wood consoles that you needed 2 people to carry with little wheels on the bottom, as if we were going to give this to homeless people or to poor people. That was not actually helping them or helping us trying to help serve them. When we think about the U.S. and our relationship with caring for the poor, historically we can see, based upon certain ethnic groups and classes in ethnic groups like African Americans and Latinos who've had unfair systems set up through the government that they're saying this is going to benefit everybody, but yet when housing is the number one, or taxes from housing is the number one source of funding for schools, when you look at the socioeconomics of an impoverished community, especially when it comes to we have very few mixed communities socioeconomically, unless you live in a metropolitan community in the downtown proper, for instance, in Cincinnati, and that's only of recent 15 years, there is still a lot of separation along class. And if I have, which was the decades of housing people in ghettos, a low home ownership, then I have low taxes to be able to put into school systems, which means the school systems are not going to be set up equally. And that affects the schooling. It affects what kind of teachers, how many teachers, it affects what you get in equipment and technology to assist the students with learning. All that continues to create disparities that do not have to be so. That's set up by systems that people employ and then justify after they employ them. And ultimately pointing the finger at the poor more than the systems around that haven't adequately supported the poor. And so what is our role is often the question. Whether it's housing, it's education, or healthcare, what's our role as committed followers of Jesus Christ? Are we willing to find ways to engage? I know you might be thinking perhaps, well, my tithes and my offering, that's how I consider the poor. I give into the church, and that is necessary. And hopefully the church has some meaningful ways where you can actually get involved with the individuals in poverty. Hopefully you've set up where you can have folk who may not have all of their needs met as full-fledged, as we like to call them, members, where they're learning and intermingling and benefiting from the community, not just someone that is being viewed as someone who's taking from the community. One of the things I loved about the work that we did with the homeless shelter was looking at the half full portion, looking at the gifts and abilities, the assets, as we called them, of each individual that has gifts and abilities. And if we can find what those are and plug them in, it's where they're going to continue to grow and evolve, as they'll find value and meaning in themselves by being able to lend themselves to community, to see themselves engaging and being of benefit to community. That is where we continue to raise the esteem of others. This being the History Month for African American history, one of the things that we used in even preparing for this and the visual that we sent out was Martin Luther King. Oftentimes people have articulated that his death had to do with this fight against racism. But really, in his latter years, what we began to see was a transition, as he had brought together people of all kinds of races and ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomics, and began to acquire funding from all around the world. Was that he was fighting to transition from how we treated the poor, no matter who they were. And with his campaign for fighting not just for civil rights, what the Disabilities Act and other rights for people who were of need of assistance, not always permanently, it's what ultimately turned those against him that sought his life. It's one thing to fight for issues around ethnicity and the civil aspects of those rights, but when you start confronting the finance and the economics, the root of all evil being greed, then that became a tremendous threat to the powers that be. And unfortunately, in the process of speaking truth to power, there's also a need to challenge the economics. When you think of the bus boycott, and when you think of when he went up north to Chicago and he was fighting with the unions around the city workers with the trash, terms are escaping me. We saw him fighting for the rights of those who were being manipulated economically. And in that, in that fight, we still see the disparities today. And since his time, we've seen those at the top continue to increase, and those in the middle class continue to decrease, and the numbers of those in poverty and generational poverty continuing to increase. And this is before COVID. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we help move our society beyond this exploitation and this subjugation? Well, each and every one of us have a responsibility to make sure that in our hearts we're loving and not loving less those who are in poverty, regardless of how we think they arrived there, or regardless of what we think of what they're doing while they're there. We know that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Paul reminds us in Galatians that it's so important for us to see ourselves as one new humanity. As he said in Ephesians, we are one new humanity, and in that we must be our brother's keeper. And when we see the injustices that are taking place in society, it is our responsibility. Justice and righteousness come before his throne, mercy and truth before. It is our responsibility as kingdom citizens. It's a double-sided coin. You can't have righteousness without the justice, or justice without the righteousness. They go hand in hand. And it is our responsibility to continue to lead such. And so we should be leading the way. We should be that city set upon a hill that can't be hidden, as we continue to confront the powers that be, to put in practice policies and procedures that are going to allow us to reclaim our sense of moral consideration for those that are in poverty. And it's also it's good for us to understand that there's, as I described earlier, generational poverty, but then there's situational poverty. COVID has produced a lot of situational poverty. Natural disasters have produced the fires that were going on out west the last couple of years have caused a lot of situational poverty. Each year down south and southwest, hurricanes, tornadoes in the Midwest cause situational poverty, where people were in a socioeconomic class and something out of their control happens, wipes out all that they have, and now they find themselves in situational poverty. And they need our support. They need our compassion. They need our empathy. And they need us to give, but to give with our whole heart. Jesus and Paul gave us admonitions about how we are to treat the poor. You cannot, as he said in Matthew 6, you cannot serve God and riches. If we come to understand that all that we possess is not for us to be possessors of, but it is so that we're a pass-through. We're not to build bigger barns, but we're to make what we have available to those that are in need, because you can't beat God's giving, as you've heard the statement say. Well, what that means is if you plant seeds, then you're going to reap a harvest. The seeds that we are to plant must be so that others who are in need have some of these needs met through us as well. You have to leave the corners of the field as it's described in Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, so that those that were strangers and sojourners could come by and could gather food as well when they did not have it to pay for. Then there's Matthew 25, where we see Jesus talking about the kingdom and its preparation from the foundation of the world. He says, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him saying, well, Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we feed you? Or thirsty and give you drink? He says, when you did it unto the least of these, when you did it to the stranger, when you did it to the sojourner, when you weren't looking at people like they're a Samaritan or they're African American or they're the Gentile or they're the Latino or they're impoverished or they made bad decisions or they had children too early or they got caught in criminality. Whatever the case may be, it is not for us to judge. It is for us to extend mercy. It is for us to offer reconciliation. It is for us to love them with our whole hearts. And for some of us, we know that once upon a time, that was us. And somewhere along the line, there was grace and there was mercy. And even now, there's favor. And so we have to take these commands and these words seriously. For James 2 reminds us there is no partiality. We cannot be respecter of persons. Our church building should not be respecter of persons. We should not treat someone coming off the street differently than we treat someone who comes in the kind of attire that says, well, they must have something. They must be somebody. We are all somebody in the eyes of the Lord, and we should be that with one another. And so we should not be segregating ourselves on Sunday morning based upon class or ethnicity, when still it's the most segregated hour of the year. And Martin Luther King said that back in the 60s. But that was actually coined in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I believe that was by Alex de Tocqueville, who was looking from afar in Europe and looking into America and making this claim long ago. And unfortunately, it's still plaguing us today. Jesus talked about how we were to share what we have within the context of the church community. And so the question, one of my favorite scriptures, and I started an organization a while back called Consider the Poor, from Psalm 41, 1, 2, and 3. And that word consider is very important. This is what I want to leave you with today. Consider means to think carefully about something, typically before making a decision. And so when I asked individuals to stop giving somebody on the street money just because they asked you for it, and find out more of what's going on and try to lead them to a place or person that can help them beyond that immediate money. I've even asked people, just go buy food. And then I've had people tell me stories, horrific stories, of people cussing them out when they wouldn't give them money and had even offered them food, because the ultimate objective was not they have a need, they're just trying to garner what you have for a purpose, like with Judas, that was not honorable, was not honest. They were not people of integrity. They weren't really in need. And I've seen people walk around with gas cans and tell stories about, my car is around the corner and I just need gas. And I've seen them week after week. You know, I've had people who I've seen in the homeless shelter and forget that I was there and then come up to me with some sad story, forgetting that I know who they are. And so it's just wiser to really consider and to think through, to think about and be drawn toward a course of action that's going to be wise and not just something that's going to be quick so you can move on to the next thing in your life. It also means to give regard to someone or something as having a specified quality. Each of us have gifts and abilities. Each of us have a half full portion, no matter what you see or think is empty within us. That if we value that, if we help even the individual perhaps to see that within themselves and to strive to walk in that. I've watched people who others would have thought they're never going to change their life. With love and compassion and support, I've watched them slowly chip away at that hard external exterior because of all of what had happened to them in their past. And all that it required was somebody that was willing to love them through themselves, through their trial, through their trauma, and through them seeing what Jesus sees in them and modeling that before them. And I've watched them do marvelous things, really rise above what others thought was never possible. So are we really having care and compassion for the poor? The poor, the statement that the poor will be with us always was not about the fact there are poverty, people in poverty today. That was about Jesus saying, look, I'm not going to be here long. And she has done this wonderful, this great thing. She has sat at my feet. She has poured this ointment on me. She understands that I'm going away. She understands the death, the burial, and she is honoring me. She is worshiping me. She is acknowledging me for who I am. And our now goal, as Jesus has gone away and left us his Holy Spirit, is to do that very same thing as well as we engage one another relationally, as we are our brother's keeper, as we are to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So there is a thin line between love and hate, but there's even a thinner line between love and, as Sadell said last week, to love less. Let's not love one another less. God bless you. This has been the Warehouse Church. Again, Pastor Sherman Bradley, we thank you for joining us. You can join us this Sunday at 10 a.m. on our Facebook page, The Warehouse Church, and YouTube, The Warehouse Church OTR, and on our streaming broadcast as well. And go to our website, and you'll find a variety of different things that you can learn. There's other messages and Bible studies there from past months, and it's a wonderful place to go and continue to learn and grow. So we thank you for joining us. God bless you. We'll see you again soon. We love you all. Thank you.